find the mean AP Stats exam score from 2016, you want to use the formula for the expected value. We can't just take the average of the numbers 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. We have to account for the fact that they all have different likelihoods or different probabilities. So the expected value formula is the sum of every outcome times its probability. So it's essentially a weighted average of the 5, the 4, the 3, the 2, and the 1. And if this kind of a question appears on the AP exam, you should always show your work. So this is each outcome. There's the outcome of 5 times its probability, 4 times its probability, 3 times its probability, 2 times its probability, and the last outcome, 1 times its probability. So if you enter that into your calculator, you'll get an average score of 2.877. So for convenience, we're just going to round that to 2.9 for the purposes of these examples. So to find the standard deviation, this is the formula for variance that's available on your formula sheet. This is the square of the standard deviation. This isn't something typically that you would have to do by hand, but this is something that's quite easy to do using the one variable stats command. So on my calculator, I have entered the outcomes into list 1 and the probabilities in list 2, and those probabilities are essentially the frequencies of those outcomes. So if you go to stat and calculate, you want to run the one variable statistics command, but our outcomes are in list 1. This time the frequency list, or the probabilities, indicate that that is in list 2. And then notice, if you run this command, it confirms our mean of 2.877, but then also it gives us the standard deviation of about 1.367. So again, for the purposes of this handout, I'm going to round that to 1.4. But being able to interpret what the standard deviation means is an important idea. The standard deviation simply tells us typically how far above or below the mean would we expect an AP student's score to be. So fine, typically, AP Stats exam scores are within one standard deviation of the mean. So they could be typically as low as, typically AP Stats exam scores are between, so between these two boundaries, they could be as low as the 2.9 minus 1.4, that would be a score of 1.5. And on the high side, we would typically expect something to be around, if I add 2.9 plus 1.4, that gives me 4.3. And that gives me my typical boundaries. Typical AP Stats exam scores are between 1.5 and 4.3. So that suggests that typical scores would include the outcomes of 2 and 3 and 4. The outcomes that aren't typical are 1s and 5s. But if you were asked to interpret this, include the decimals, because these are boundaries that then we could use to go back and interpret which actual possible outcomes are the typical outcomes and which ones aren't typical.